let's talk about knowing truth, knowing God's truth through personal experience and experimentation. So what do we mean by knowing truth through personal experience and experimentation?
Well, this is very similar to knowing truth through observation in a way. With observation, we're looking at things, cause and effect. But with observation, frequently, it's not what's happening to me. In fact, quite often, we're not as logical in observation when it's happening to me as we are when it's happening to somebody else. We obviously, when it's happening to somebody else, we often can see, oh, well, there's the cause, there's the effect, there's the cause, there's the effect. But when it's happening to me, because I'm embroiled in the situation emotionally, and as we've already discussed, there are distortions to our logic because of our emotional condition. We often, when it comes to having that personal experience, it's a very different experience than it is observing it externally. But it does have specific teaching ability to help us gather truth. Maybe if I can give you some examples. If you look at a child, just growing up, just standing up, just starting to stand up. Now, as most parents know, while the child's crawling, it's pretty easy to child-proof your home to a degree. But when the child starts walking, it's much more difficult to child-proof your home. And so now you have to start educating the child about things that are dangerous to it. And some of those things that are dangerous to it are things like hot, things that are hot, like the stove, cooking, or a heater, that's in the main living room where everybody gathers around, or a fire. These kind of things are very hot. Now, you can tell the child and you can educate the child, hot, Bernie, don't touch, and all those kind of things. You can say all of those kind of things, but it's highly unlikely the child is going to actually believe you.
Take your hearsay.
Take your hearsay. Or even through observation of you getting burnt, until they personally have the experience of getting burnt. Once they touch the stove or touch the fire and they feel the burn and they feel the pain, they then realise, wow, that hurt. There's obviously a reason for it hurting, and the reason is related to what I just did. So I'm going to now attempt to avoid those kind of situations where I might be personally exposed, my skin might be personally exposed to that kind of fire or heat. Now, interestingly, these things can help us a lot to understand the motivation of whoever created us. Because obviously, in this process, the pain, the beauty of the pain, in fact, there is a very essential part that the pain actually plays, this instant pain. And that is, it tells you the limitation of your created body. If we did not have the pain associated with that, we would put our hand in the fire and our hand could literally burn off. And we could lose the complete existence of our hand through that process if there was no pain associated with the hand being put in the fire. And you could see straight away that would mean that we'd now lose our hand, potentially lose the ability to use it. And obviously that's not whoever created us' intention. So what they've done is created a pain mechanism so that we know the limitations of our creation. And that is a loving act, to actually understand the limitations of our creation. And the child who at this stage can't even be educated intellectually in most cases is able to understand these basic forms of communication of information, of truth, and can respond to them, and therefore survive, and therefore live a long life. And so we see this personal process of the experience has a very strong effect on us and our ability to make decisions based on what is true and what is not. Of course, unfortunately, we often don't differentiate between our experience with people and our experience with God's other creations. And this is where we often become very distorted in our emotional analysis of the effects. Right?
Could you give an example of that?
Well, an example of that might be that there's a difference between somebody purposefully lighting a fire to burn me and me being accidentally burned by a law that says when my fingers get too hot, there's going to be pain, right? There is a complete difference in intention there. And we might then start thinking the fire itself has an intention.
Yes.
When the actual the fire is just a law involved in the creation of fire. It has no intention of its own. There is just a law that says I'm going to burn. If I've got matter and material and oxygen and fuel to burn, I will burn. And if there's a spark or a flame, I'm going to burn. That's all the fire does. There's no other emotional intent in it. But unfortunately, what we often do with many of God's laws is we start assuming there's emotional intent that's harmful. So in other words, when we get cancer, we assume that God's intent is harmful in creating it when we don't understand its real cause. And so we're still struggling, if you like, with the joining of cause, the actual cause, with the effect.
So that's a certain drawback of knowledge of truth through personal experience.
Yeah.
It's interesting that when you were talking about the example of the child burning their hand, for example, and then you went on to talk about how we can sort of extrapolate things about God and God's nature and God's truth through observing that and analysing that. And they're things that we've talked about earlier in the discussion, aren't they? The knowledge of truth through observation and then through intellectual analysis of law. So really, you've linked the idea of knowing truth through personal experience and experimentation. It's basically like you're saying, if we have an experience, a personal experience, and then if we add to it the observation that happens for everyone, for example, and then we analyse what that must mean. Oh, this certain thing happens for everyone. And what does that say about our physical body, and also the truth about God's truth about our body, God's truth about law, God's truth about how we function, and the truth about God's nature. So you're really marrying three different ways, and it seems to me that it's almost another category on its own, isn't it, where we start to synthesize all of the different ways of knowing truth.
You could say it is, but it's really just us using all the different methods in concert, isn't it, together to extrapolate what the truth may be. All of them have different flaws or drawbacks, but by merging them together, we start to get a picture that therefore we can make more of our serious life choices and decisions about. So that's a really good thing. So when it comes to determining God's truth about any matter, we can see that frequently what we're doing is synthesizing or using many methods in concert with each other to determine the truth. And in fact, we have to do that if we don't know the last few ways of doing it, of finding laws. We have to use these other methods in concert with each other, because it's the only way to determine enough of the truth that we are able to survive.
Okay, well, just rounding up the ability to know God's truth through personal experience and experimentation. It seems like that's a very quick and powerful. When we have an experience, it can be quite a bit more impactful. When you talked about the experience of the child burning their hand, you mentioned it seems to have more impact.
Well, I feel if we differentiate between experience and experimentation, because experience does usually have a very rapid and powerful impact upon us, but we don't always know its cause. That's the drawback.
So we don't actually know what's actually happened, really. We're just having a powerful experience. And unless there's some analysis or repeatability of what we've done, it's not necessarily reliable. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily, because bear in mind that many of the experiences we have may have invisible causes, things that we can't see causing them. And under those circumstances, it's quite difficult to see the relationship between the cause and the effect. When it comes to experimentation, it's a much slower process generally, because what we normally do with experimentation is we create a safe environment, not like the child just going straight up and touching, the hot stove. We create a safe environment, and then what we have to do is postulate ideas or concepts through our imagination or through what we observe from other things, and then come up with potential solutions to those particular problems through experimentation. Now, that could take many thousands of years on any single subject to fully determine. So while the personal experience side is quite rapid in many cases, but we don't always know its result, the experimentation side is frequently very slow and takes many years, hundreds of years or thousands of years in order to find the answers.
And would you say that being personally involved in an experiment has more drawbacks or benefits than me observing an experiment?
Well, obviously, if you're personally involved in the experiment, there's a higher potential for pain than if you're observing somebody else involved in the experiment.
Yes. So what is the implications of that?
Well, the implications of that is that most people want to experiment on things that usually don't involve themselves in some way because they're afraid of getting hurt. And the implications of that are that it's much slower to discover what the truth is, obviously. And of course, fortunately nowadays, we have laws even that have been created to limit the risk of experimentation because you could potentially harm the entire human society with some experiments that you engage in if there weren't some kind of rules or laws that governed how much you experiment with things and what you're willing to do with these experiments. And we see that particularly in the case of disease, where humans have created diseases specifically for the purpose of war or chemical processes for the purpose of war and so forth. And if there weren't severe limitations placed on these particular things, the whole of the human race could be in jeopardy. So you can see that the problem with experimentation, you can still find truth with it, but unless you're very ethical and very moral, you also have the potential to cause a lot of damage to other people as well.
And would you also say that, say I engage in a personal experiment and I can see a couple of different things that could be potential benefits and drawbacks. One potential drawback is that unless I'm very honest about what are the actual outcomes of the experiment, then my experience I could be very subjective about it and allow my emotional condition to dictate how I analyse the results of the experiment.
Of course, that's always going to be a problem.
A problem, yeah. However, I can see the benefit is that if I am very honest, I get very real results quickly, and I can. So again, we're talking about knowledge of God's truth in this discussion.
And again, we can see that ethics and morality of the individual and being involved in the analysis is a key part to discovering it.
Yes.
And we can see how that plays out. If we are not ethical or moral in the way that we engage in the experiments or engage in our personal experience, we could cause very, very severe problems and still not understand the underlying cause.
And God's truth about any matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you can see now, discovering truth isn't just a matter of presentation of facts now, is it? It's now, when we analyse all of these things we've put together so far, it's not just a presentation of facts. It's not
just Finding Divine Truth YouTube channel. Found God's truth.
Now I know the fact because it has to be, there has to be some ethics and morals involved in the facts, and without them, truth is still going to elude us if we're not careful.
You mean ethics and morality involved in our analysis of things?
Not only our analysis, but let's say, and we engage in an experiment. In the experiment itself, needs to be ethical and moral. If we're observing things, that needs to be ethical and moral too. Like it's not very nice of us, ethically or morally, to go and observe a war without any desire to stop the war, in some way. So,
but why does the lack of ethics and morality in observation prevent me from knowing truth? Just knowing truth, remember, we're talking about.
We obviously have emotional reasons why we want to observe something that we have no desire to change.
Yes.
So this is what I'm stating, is we obviously have some ethical or moral problem that causes us to be fascinated by a certain issue, but that we have no desire to change it. And this is things like, you see this a lot with natural disasters, where people are so attracted to observing them over and over and over again, but have no desire to understand their causes or no desire to mitigate the effects of them.
So you're saying that the inherent issue with ethics and morality is going to colour what I perceive to be truth.
Yes.
So I can't, unless ethics and morality is within me, which is almost another factor than you're introducing that we need in establishing God's truth.
Of course.
Then unless that's present, we can't reliably know God's truth about anything.
No, because we are going to make presumptions based on our immoral and unethical position.
And that's basically comes through in each of the points that we've mentioned, isn't it? The idea of knowing God's truth through hearsay.
Yes, if we look at hearsay, we go back to hearsay, for example, we can see that if we're unethical or immoral about it, we can perpetrate a whole lot of lies.
And also think that it's perfectly fine to think that I know truth when I'm learning it from someone who's clearly
unethical
or unloving.
Yeah.
And if we look at the second point that we discussed, knowing truth through observation, and I think we touched on this a little bit, if we're not ethical and moral in the way that in terms of being honest with ourselves about what it is we're observing, we'll be tempted to believe something is true when it is not.
Not only that, and also being honest about the fact we don't know all of the potential causes. There might be a whole slew of potential causes that are invisible to us, that have never crossed our mind, that we may need to find.
And so you're saying that part of ethics and morality is being humble to knowing I don't know everything about this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. If we were truly ethical and moral, we would admit that. But unfortunately, particularly when it comes to science today, it becomes very arrogant in the physical, and so it doesn't admit that.
Yeah.
And that's where there's a huge problem with regard to the discovery of truth through observation.
Yeah. Okay, our third one was knowing truth through intellectual analysis of law.
You can see exactly the same thing's going to apply. If I'm not morally or ethically in analysing such a thing, I could make presumptions about why a person created a law that have nothing to do with reality, but have everything to do with my immoral or unethical presumption.
Yeah.
So again, I'm going to be flawed with understanding the truth if I do that.
Yeah. And then the fourth one that we've discussed so far was knowing truth through personal experience and experimentation. And as we've mentioned, that's going to be problematic if we're not first ethical and moral.
Exactly. So you can see all the way through, the question was, how do we know God's truth about anything? You can see part of it is ourselves becoming ethical and moral. Needs to be stated, doesn't it? We need to become ethical and moral ourselves before we can really know God's truth about anything. Because if we're not going to ethically and morally examine issues, then unfortunately we're going to be predisposed to lie.
Yes.
And therefore predisposed to perpetrating it and accepting it.
And rejecting truth. So really you're almost saying that a cornerstone of like the capacity or the ability to know God's truth about anything is to have a desire to be ethical and moral in all situations.
Yes.
And is it correct to say that without that desire, we cannot know God's truth?
Not really. No, we may find bits and pieces of it. And we may be able to, and in particular, we usually find the physical parts of it, things like the stove that's alight burning us and things like that, and gravity pulling us to the ground, things like that. But when it comes to being truly ethical, when it comes to analysing the potential of us having thousands of causes that we do not know because they're invisible to us, we often skip over all of that.
Yeah.
And that's a disaster for the human race, because if you look at our lifestyle, even now, physically, there are many things that we live our life by now that are all invisible.
Yeah.
So we must make the presumption that maybe there are many, many, many more things that are invisible that are affecting our lives.
Yeah.
That we might be able to measure if we were aware of them. Right? But by denying awareness, which is an unethical state,
yeah,
to deny that we're not fully aware is an unethical state. You know, it's like saying, I know everything, and we don't, and we should know that we don't. But by saying that to ourselves, we preclude ourselves from receiving more knowledgeable or truthful information.